Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chair of the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. It's late July 2025, and I want in this presentation to look at money growth trends in the main advanced economies in order to develop a view about where the world economy is going in the next few quarters, looking on into 2026, but particularly really with a focus on the second half of this year. I'll just say a few words about the world we're living in so we get a sense of the relative size of the main economies. I'm not going to say much today about India, China, Brazil and so on, because I want to focus on the advanced world. So what I'm going to do first of all is so there's going to be a lot about American monetary trends, but also about monetary trends in the Eurozone, Japan and the UK. Now, the first picture I want to show you is about the relative size of the main advanced economies in a global context. So we have here a pie chart of the shares of world output represented by the four main economies that I've shown here. You can see the dominance on this measure of the United States. This is a measure of output where we look at current prices and current exchange rates. Now, this can be very misleading because, for example, the price of a haircut in the United States is much higher than the price of a haircut in India because of the relative labor costs. But frankly, and I don't want to be unkind to hairdressers, but a haircut is a haircut is a haircut. And so the differences in quality between the nations are not as much as difference in prices. And there is a different way of looking at this subject where we look at output in terms of what's called purchasing power parity. And I'll come on to that in a second. But this is the different main economies in terms of current prices, current exchange rates. And in 2024, it was dominated by the USA with over a quarter of world output, you see 26.4%. Then came the Eurozone. On these numbers is slightly under 15% of world output, and then Japan and the UK. The UK, in my judgment, is too large here relative to Japan, but this again reflects the exchange rate, and Japan has had an undervalued yen for some time. So we can see, therefore, that on this measure, these economies account for about half of world output. If we look at money growth trends in these economies, that will then, since in my view, money growth drives the growth of the nominal GDP, this will then give us quite a good clue, quite a good picture for what's happening to half of world output, and then from, obviously much of that'll influence the rest of the world too. I should just say here that there are other quite important economies on this measure, such as South Korea, Australia, Canada, but the Institute's resources are limited and we don't look at them. Okay, now then, let's then look at these economies again using this purchasing power parity approach. The American share of world output, so as haircuts not being valued quite so highly, is reduced substantially. It's reduced to about 15%. The Eurozone share also comes down, and so do those of Japan and the UK. And these economies collectively account for about a third of world output. Now, if you add in India and China, these economies together, that is, those four plus India plus China, you're talking about 60% of world output. Every month in our monetary note, we look at money growth trends in those 6 economies. By the way, on the current price, current exchange rates, those 4 plus India and China is 70%. So what we're trying to do in this exercise is to get a sense of money trends and then the prospects for the growth of nominal GDP, output growth, inflation in the world as a whole. And here again we have the actual numbers, and we can see that there are some other economies such as Russia, Brazil, Indonesia that are also quite important in terms of purchasing power parity. But the 4 big advanced economies, India and China, being very important. Okay, so what we're going to do now is that's the world we're looking at. Now let's just have a look at money growth trends in each of the 4 advanced countries and then try and draw some conclusions about growth and inflation in coming quarters. Now, in the kind of work I do at the Institute, there's a huge focus on the USA. According to current prices, current exchange rates, a quarter of world output, purchasing power parity, 15% of world output, bit smaller than China, purchasing power parity terms, but still very important. And here is the chart of deposits, bank deposits. Now, all my work is about broad money. It's been the key to my success in the 2020s, analysing economies, and by the way, success in a longer career too. And bank deposits are the main component of broad money. Just at the moment, I can't get good figures on the broad money measure I really want in the USA, but bank deposits give me 80–90% of the story. And you can see here, this takes us back to the start of the 2020s. You can see that great surge in money growth in 2020. You see then a more, still rather strong growth, but a bit slower. A period of contracting deposits, contracting money in 22 and 23, and then more stable since kind of summer, autumn 2023. Now, in my view, it's really the guts of what I'm arguing through the Institute. It's low and stable growth of the quantity of money, really of bank deposits, which is crucial to macroeconomic stability and inflation control. That great leap in money in 2020, bit of it also 2021, correctly forecast the inflation that we had in late 21 and 22. The fall in money then from kind of spring 22 correctly said inflation would come back under control. And I said both of these things. And so what does one say about what's been happening really since, say, autumn 2023? Well, actually, you can see from this chart that we are getting back to low and stable growth of money, and that is excellent in its way, whatever else one says about what's been going on in that period. So, fine. Now let's look at this in a little bit more detail. The chart I just showed you had a scale which went up to, what was it, something like, 80% or so growth of money. I've now got a quite different scale to look at the period since autumn 23. And you can see here that there had been this surge in money, fall in money, this more stable period, but actually a recovery from a contraction, then you see this line gradually moving upwards, lots of ups and downs. This is the 3-month annualized growth rate of bank deposits. So what I do is I look at what's happening to the growth of bank deposits the last 13 weeks and then annualize it, assume it carries on for 52 weeks. It's going up, really. I'm not dramatically. The last few figures are kind of 5, 6, 7% maybe. They're not kind of up at what we had in 2020, when for a few weeks it was actually over 50, 60, 70%. But I would say that chart justifies us in drawing one very strong conclusion. Despite Trump, despite all the uncertainties about tariffs, despite all of the hoo-ha about cuts in some kinds of government spending and so on, despite all that, this is actually quite positive for American economic activity, and says there won't be a recession in late 2025 or in 2026. Big conclusion to draw? I'm drawing it now. What I'd also say about this is that, fine in a way, except that the American economy is pretty fully employed at the moment. So if we're going to have, say, trend growth, possibly even a bit above trend growth, then that means that inflation is going to be rather more persistent than the Federal Reserve would like, and the scope for reducing interest rates is limited. You see, back in the background here, you've got the banking system being some of the restrictions that were imposed on it at the time of the great financial crisis back in 2008, 2009. They're being eased, those restrictions are being eased, and there's this vast budget deficit that has to be financed, so that money growth is edging up, and that's saying that there may be some problems getting inflation back under control. What about the Eurozone? This is a chart going back 20 or so years, and I want you again just to notice the strong growth early 2020s, period of slight contraction in 22, 23, and then a blip up in the recent quarters. The numbers are not as high as in the USA in recent months. They're fine. Again, many problems in the Eurozone in terms of large budget deficits in France and surging defense spending in Germany and all that kind of stuff. But these numbers, recent months have been fine, 3-4% growth of money, which is ideal. What about Japan? Now, Japan is very different from other advanced countries because it did have a period in the 1990s when the banking system was crippled by excessive debt to a degree that wasn't true elsewhere. And in a way, the banking system has been struggling ever since. There was, as you can see, this blip upwards in money growth in 2020 as elsewhere, but it wasn't on the same scale. Money growth at an annual figure never reached double digits, whereas in the USA it reached 25%, in the UK 15%, and in the Eurozone 12 or 13%. Never reached double digits in Japan. They didn't raise interest rates in 2022 and 2023, so the yen collapsed, and they have had some inflation in the recent past, but with numbers peaking at kind of 3.5%, nothing like the double-digit numbers seen in the USA, the Eurozone, and the UK. Now, the main point about Japan is that last few figures are negative. The quantity of money is actually falling. And one has to say this is, if anything, rather negative for the global outlook. Japan, as I showed you, not on the current numbers, a particularly big economy, but still one of the larger ones of the advanced countries. And okay, and then finally the UK. Money numbers in the UK in the recent past have been fine. Same sort of picture as in the USA and the Eurozone. Leap in 2020, period of contraction, then more recently growth, but at a low rate. I think the real problem so this is kind of neutral for the global outlook, small the UK is. The more important point to make about the UK, I think, is that the present Labour government has been very unconvincing in terms of its control of the public finances. Rachel Reeves had the rather unfortunate episode of crying in the House of Commons because she couldn't get the control of spending that she wanted. She knew there was a problem with the budget deficit. And in fact, the budget deficit expected by the Conservatives in spring 2024, before the July 2024 general election in the UK, was for a deficit in 25-26 of under 80 billion, whereas the current figure is around about 140 billion. And so there's been slippage here of about 80% compared with spring last year, a period of a little more than 15 months. That to me is a measure of frankly of incompetence, and contrasts sharply with what happened under New Labour back in the late 1990s, when Gordon Brown committed to keeping the same kind of financial restraint on public finances under the previous Conservative government. Anyway, so it seems to me all too plausible that at some point in the next 4 years of Labour government that there'll be some kind of financial crisis, but I don't know what and when. Okay, that completes this survey of money growth trends in the leading economies. Obviously America, much the most important, and Eurozone also quite important. And the message, I think, is pretty simple, which is that things on the money growth side are fine. Budget deficits is another story. And the budget deficits threaten continued low money growth to the extent that the deficits are financed from the banks, they create new bank deposits. But that's something we'll follow on a month-by-month basis. I always like to cross-check. I look at money data, I look at banking systems. They've given me a very good lead on many global macroeconomic trends in my career. And the reason that I've set up the Institute of International Monetary Research is precisely because other economists don't do this in the same way. That's their problem. This is a very successful way of analyzing economies. Having said that, I do cross-check with looking at global leading indicators for the main economies. And I look particularly at work done by the OECD, the multinational organization based in Paris. And they prepare a global leading indicator index looking at, say, housing starts, looking at car registration, this kind of stuff, for all the main economies, combine it for the G7. The countries I just talked about in this presentation have been substantially G7 economies. And this is the chart that then comes out from the OECD looking ahead in the next few quarters. You can see it's going up. So I think my main conclusion is that despite all the uncertainties and there have been new risks created by the Trump administration in the USA. Despite that, the prospect for the world economy in the next few quarters is okay, but we must keep a watching eye on those budget deficits, and we'll come back to that in future presentations from the Institute of International Monetary Research. Thank you.